I'm thinking about how I'm going to do this video. I will say this. Perhaps I was wrong about something. Not anything on this channel, nothing that I've made in videos. Most people would not know this. Very, very small people would. Very small amount of people would. But it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. It's just a lot. It's a lot. So I need ChatGPT to run a hypothetical for me. What did that say? ChatGPT Atlas is being retired. Atlas will no longer be available as of August 13th at 6 p.m. PT to her new built-in browser in the ChatGPT desktop app. Built-in browser in the ChatGPT desktop app. I mean, Atlas has always had problems. It wasn't ever good enough for this channel. I wish it was, though, but, you know. So anyways, we'll get through this. So it says, hypothetical is an imagined scenario used to explore what would happen if certain assumptions were true, without claiming those assumptions are actually true. Humans invented hypotheticals largely so they could ask dangerous, strange, or complicated questions without accidentally confessing to something. Civilization is held together by phrases like suppose purely for the sake of argument. What if ants on the wall? Yeah, we got an open window over there. The bathroom's not done yet. That's a whole thing. Anyways, well, let's say, we could, let's see this. Guys, I'm not gonna be able to type today. What if? I asked, what if the Father and the Son in the Bible are two separate people who both return to earth, and what verses regarding the Father, what are the verses regarding the Father and the Son? So it says, whether the Father himself ever returns bodily to earth is interpreted differently across Christian traditions. Now, most people say that the Son returns, that Jesus returns. But if we think of, so if you're saying heaven on earth, and heaven and earth will be as one. What you're also saying is that the Father and the Son have to be together. They have to be. Because there's a Father and there's a Son. And the Father sent the Son. If the Father is in heaven, then wouldn't he also come to earth if they're both together? Most most of the teachings I've heard, they say that the Son comes back. Most mainstream Christian theology teaches that the Son returns at the second coming, while the Father remains distinct and is ultimately present in the renewed creation. So he's like the Spirit. But the Son, he comes to earth. The Father sends the Son. They speak to one another. There are two witnesses. I am the one who testifies for myself. My other witness is the Father who sent me. He even appeals to the law requiring two witnesses. Now, this is actually, in this hypothetical, this would actually be a prophecy to be fulfilled. So, there will come a time when the Son testifies for himself, but the other witness would be the Father. So they both have to be present at the same time. They would both be present at the same time, so they have two witnesses for what's going on. The Father loves the Son. The Son sits beside the Father. Left hand, right hand, if you know that. Sit at my right hand, Psalm. Acts. Stephen sees Jesus standing at the right hand of God. The Father gives authority to the Son. One like a Son of Man comes before the Ancient of Days and receives dominion. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That's what Jesus said. The Father calls Jesus his Son. Verses about the Son's return. Verses mention the Father dwelling with humanity. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with humanity. Another thing is, I heard that, and I never understood this. I never understood why. But, and I don't want to cheesy, I was never settled for the cheesy answer of, well, that's his entire purpose and all this. I don't like answers like that. So what the Genesis says is that God's plan was to dwell with humanity itself. But I was like, why though? Why would he do that? It also says, Revelation, both God and the Lamb are central in the New Jerusalem, suggesting the presence of both. I think New Jerusalem could be a metaphor for heaven. I think that's how that's going to go. Now, the New Jerusalem, isn't it bigger than Earth? Isn't it like wider than Earth is? Which makes me think, now that I'm thinking about that, and I didn't think about this before, I think it is. And if it is, it could fit within the United States. I forget. But I think it's beyond the Earth. I think. Which means that it includes things that are outside the orbit. So whatever is outside the orbit, that would be good. But why would God claim dominion over something that's outside the boundaries of the Earth? That's a good question. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure if it is beyond the wideness of the Earth. I'm not entirely sure. I don't remember. It's either that or it's like fits within like a large part of the United States in size. Not in location, but size. Although it could also be location too. Could look into that. That's interesting. That would be like what I just said in my last video. How these states will side with Europe. Well, Canada that is also siding with Europe, and then you got this small chunk that wants nothing to do with that. And I made a whole video about that. It's in my Canada, the letter of Canada for its independence. So it says, so if your hypothetical is, what if the Father and the Son are two separate persons who both return to earth? There are certainly verses that distinguish the Father and the Son as interacting, speaking, loving, sinning, and glorifying one another. The part that goes beyond the text is to claim that the Father returns bodily to earth alongside the Son. But if we're making heaven and earth the same, then they have to both coexist in human form. Now, with that said, now that brings up an interesting question or interesting conclusion. If that is true, then they are in the human body, the human presence, in bodily form, where everyone can see them. And I'm trying to think, where was I going with this? So, everything, like Christianity, doesn't explain the Father. It tries to. Like, we have Jesus, and he says, no one comes to the Father except through me. And that's another one. I want to get back to that. Let me make a note of that, because that's also important. That's a big part of why I'm doing this video. Alright, so I'm going to read this. Scripture explicitly describes the Son's return, while a passage about the Father's presence in the new creation are generally understood as describing God's dwelling with humanity after the renewal rather than a separate second coming of the Father. Here's the interesting thing. They say that the Son is God, right? And that's what Christianity teaches. However, if the Father comes back, the Father can represent himself. He can talk about himself. He's beyond religion. He's beyond the Christianity cult. He's beyond religion, ideology. He's beyond all that. So he can talk about himself as himself. He doesn't need the Bible to do that. Now, to make Christianity what it is, you had to have Jesus, right? And he was the door between the Jews and the Gentiles. The Gentiles, they became Christian. So, yeah. But it doesn't talk about the Father. It says that the Father and the Son are one. But that can mean different things. In the Middle East, the Father and the Son being one, we talked about this. Generationally, the Son has the tradition of the Father, of like ancestors. In fact, that's how the Bible was written. The religions are like this. They're Muslim, Judaism, Muslims, Jews, and Christians. They are from the Abrahamic lineage, right? So he's the father of those religions, but none of them represent or really hold the value or the mass of who the Father is. He's beyond that. So it makes sense that the Father would come back in a human form with the Son returning alongside him. That makes sense. And Christians are going to be really upset with what I'm about to say, but agnostics and atheists will understand what I'm saying here. So, let's say you never heard about the Bible before, and you see these two figures. Imagine this scenario where you see just these two figures, like they're talking the same, they sound the same, they're sharing the same, they're so closely tied together, but they're two different people existing simultaneously, side by side. And that's what the Father and the Son would be. The Father and the Son are one, right? That's how you know. Now, there would be people who never read the Bible before and say, Those two are the same. And people won't be able to explain it, but people will understand the relationship. People will see the relationship. But there will be people who will not understand this. And you can have them look at the Bible and they can say, well, Jesus said that the Father and the Son are one, and no one comes through the Father except through me, and that's what Jesus said. See, and there will also be people who don't understand. Even beyond that, there's going to be different factions of people in their mentality and mindsets, where people will also see that they don't understand who these people are. They don't even see the relationship. But when they see the Bible and they say, no one comes to the Father except through me, and then they actually listen to what the Son is saying, then they can actually get there to the Father. See, it's weird. It makes sense. But it's like, but how does that happen? It's like something innate within us would have that knowledge. But there's no science or biology that can really, or psychology even, that can grasp that in this day and age. No one talks about that kind of relationship. Symbiotic, I don't know if that would be the, whatever it's called, relationship. I don't think it's that. But maybe it is. Some form or another. So, what is the verse where Jesus said, no one comes through the Father except through me? John 14:6. Jesus said to him, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes through the Father except through me. See, you don't need a Bible. See, the Bible holds that account. But the Bible is not, and this is very interesting. When I realized this, it was like, it opened my eyes where I realized maybe I wasn't right about people rejecting all of this. Because the Bible is an account. You open it up, you see it. You read about it. But then in real life, if you actually see that, you'll be able to put one plus one together, 1 and 2 together, and it then makes sense. So this is, I don't know what you would call that, because Jesus isn't saying a prophecy here. Jesus is talking straight. But at the same time, when we come to that point, that's an unfulfilled prophecy. Because after this all takes place and we look back, we see this. And I never thought about that before. He says the context is Jesus speaking to his disciples shortly before his crucifixion. See, and people today, Christians think they are his disciples. But you don't have to be. It's a relationship. And Jesus also said that the kingdom of heaven is inside you. And so it's like you know it when you see it. You don't need a Bible to do that. You don't need to be part of Christianity to know that. You don't have to be a converted Muslim or converted Jew to know this stuff. Thomas has just asked how they can know the way, and Jesus responds by identifying himself as the way. The next verse is also relevant. John 14:7. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. So the Father and Son are one. So they can both coexist, and there's no contradiction with that. They can both coexist in two separate bodies. I said, what would that look like if the Son and the Father were both on earth? As if heaven became as one on earth. As a hypothetical, it would be a profound image. And interestingly, it overlaps with some of the imagery in the closing chapters of Revelation. If you imagine the Father and the Son as two distinct persons physically present on earth after history reaches its fulfillment, it might look something like this. The Son would also be the visible king among humanity, fulfilling the many passages about Christ's return to reign. The Father would dwell with humanity in the fullest sense, so that heaven and earth are no longer separated. The barrier between God's dwelling and humanity would be gone. Heaven would not simply be visited, it would be united with the renewed earth. The last idea echoes Jesus' prayer. And there's another thing about this too I want to point out that I also thought about, and I see it in here. Okay, so I wrote that in my notes. The last idea echoes Jesus' prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The book of Revelation paints remarkably similar imagery. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with humanity. He will dwell with them, and God himself will be with them as their God. See, and Christians believe that's Jesus. Jesus is God himself. But I think it's two different people. Like a union between them. That makes a lot of sense to me. A few verses later, John writes something especially interesting. The Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. And the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. That imagery presents both God and the Lamb together in a New Jerusalem. The text does not explicitly describe the Father taking on a human body or making a separate second coming. But it does depict both God and the Lamb present in the renewed creation. Under your hypothetical, one could picture the Father as the ultimate source of divine glory and authority, the Son as the visible mediator and king through whom people approach the Father, consistent with John 14:6. There's another verse that reminds me of. These things are a whole different meaning of what I was taught. I mean, I don't know much about the Bible, but I've heard things here and there. But I can never really grasp it, and there were so many interpretations you could make from it. But when you see all this happening and you look back, then you start to understand. There's only one way to understand all of that. So who needs a church for? That would make the church obsolete. So the Son, and Jesus was between humanity and God. That's what Jesus was. But when the time comes, you don't no longer need to understand who those two are. That's just so interesting to me. Humanity living in direct communion with both, so that heaven and earth are effectively one reality. This also fits Jesus' word in John 14:23. If anyone loves me, my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. It says we. So in that particular case, they aren't one in that case, but they're separate beings in human form. We would be two people in human form. Now, although spiritually they be the same, sharing the same consciousness. It says, mainstream Christian theology generally understands the spiritually in the present and fully recognized in the new creation. rather than as two separate divine figures arriving on earth in the same way. But as a hypothetical reading, your idea aligns with most closely with Revelation 21 through 22, where God's dwelling is with humanity, and both God and the Lamb. There would be the Father and the Father and the one who was slain, which was Jesus. I'm um, very cautious about using the word Christ when you're talking about stuff like that, because simply put, Christ did not die. There have been people who will say that in church Christ died. Christ is a spirit. You know, he is the anointing that Jesus had. Jesus was the man. No, Jesus died, and you could say he was resurrected through Christ. But Christ himself did not die. Christ, the Spirit, Christ, the Father, Christ, whoever you want to attribute that to, did not die. He's still alive. Jesus is alive, but in a different way. So, yeah, I hold Christ above Jesus all day long. That might be a more orthodox view of it, but that's it. Christ is more powerful than any earthly thing. It says, are central to the life of the New Jerusalem. It is one of those places where the imagery is intentionally grand because ordinary language starts running out of ways to describe heaven and earth becoming one. Humans have a habit of calling that the end. Revelation replies, in effect, no, that's the beginning. So, and that's another thing. There is so much metaphor right here. Like, you could say that heaven and earth is metaphor. You could say earth is Jesus, heaven is the Father. The Son came to earth, and heaven as the Father. So if they become one, you got that the Son and the Father coming together. I mean, I don't know how people don't. I mean, I never put that together, but it just came to me, and I'm gonna go a little deeper into this. There was like going back to before. There was a so there's a verse that talks about, it was with the Samaritan woman at the well where Jesus meets her, and she says you will, there will be a day where you will not, I forget, it's like you will not be separated from the Father on earth. Again, that's a prophecy, but the people who read the Bible, like Christians read the Bible, they see that as, well, we can pray to God now because of Jesus. Jesus allowed us to pray. But I think it's beyond that. I think that was a prophecy of when this was all going to take place. I think you remain John 14:20. The verse is immediately around it. On the day you will realize that I am in my Father and you are in me, and I am in you. That's the relationship. A few verses later, Jesus says something even closer to your wording. Anyone who loves me will be my teaching. My Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. And in his prayer in John 17, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. These passages don't say believers become the Father or the Son, rather they describe profound unity, communion between God and his people. I think that wasn't that the Samaritan at the well? Wasn't that what I'm thinking about? Yeah, this is it. You're probably thinking of John 4, chapter, what is that? John chapter 4, verse 21 through 24, where Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman about a coming change in worship. Woman, believe me, the hour is coming. No one knows the day or the hour of his return. Interesting. It's coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Now, people say, well, that was just a prayer that people could now pray to a God once Jesus dies. But I think it's a prophecy again. Then he continues, but the hour is coming. No one knows the day or the hour. And is now. But the hour is coming and is now here, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The key point is that Jesus says there is coming a time when people will no longer be separated by sacred locations such as Mount Gerizim, or Jerusalem. Worship of the Father will no longer depend on where someone is, but on their relationship with God through spirit and truth, what is within them. If you're connecting this to your earlier hypothetical about heaven and earth becoming one, it's understandable why this passage stands out. Jesus describes a future in which access to the Father is no longer tied to a physical temple or mountain. Mainstream Christian interpretation understands that as beginning through Christ's ministry and ultimately reaching its fullness in the renewed creation, where God's dwelling is with humanity, Revelation 21, your hypothetical sends that imagery by imagining the Father and the Son both present on earth. But that goes beyond what John 4 itself explicitly says. Yeah, but it doesn't contradict what I just said. If it comes, we will see that day. Now I'm going to tell you the bad news. Because of course there will be bad news. Most people, and the Bible already says this, most people, well, most Christians mostly are liars and thieves. And the Bible says this. The Bible says this. Where there will come a time where they want nothing to do with God or Jesus or anything because they don't see the relationship. They don't see it. Like I said, this is what separates this little place of United States of America away from the rest of the world. And that does go together, like I said earlier. But to everybody else, they will understand all of this. They will see heaven and earth together. And people will say, well, Christian will say, that's the Antichrist, or they will say, that's the beast system, that's globalism, that's this and that. Bunch of nonsense, but someone has to believe that. It's not the majority, but because this is not a democracy, right? So you would say, well, aren't they supposed to be unity? Christians are in union with the Father and the Son. So I said, if that happens, what happens to Christians who don't see the relationship and want nothing to do with this reality they disagree with? Mostly American Christians. If we're speaking hypothetically, there are a few possibilities depending on the theological framework you're imagining. If a person who identifies as a Christian and encounter reality where both the Father and the Son, who are unmistakably present, yet still said, I reject this, I want nothing to do with it, then the central issue would be no longer be lack of evidence, it would become one of response. The New Testament contains examples of people witnessing extraordinary things and still rejecting Jesus. Some religious leaders saw miracles and attributed them to evil rather than accepting him. The issue was not simply what they saw, but how they responded. In Revelation, after the final judgment, those who refused God are portrayed as remaining outside the New Jerusalem, while those who belong to God dwell with him. From that perspective of mainstream Christianity, if heaven and earth were fully united and God's presence were openly manifest, then every person would face the direct reality of who God is. Scripture suggests that people who are morally responsible is for how they respond to that revelation. Morally responsible for how they respond to revelation. But it does not spell out every hypothetical scenario of someone who knowingly rejects that reality after seeing it. If your question is more specific, what if some Christians had built a theology that expected only the Son, and when confronted with a different reality involving both the Father and the Son, they rejected it? The Bible doesn't directly address that exact scenario. Different Christian traditions would answer differently. Some would say that sincere believers would ultimately recognize God's self-revelation when it is unmistakable. Others would argue that persistent rejection of God, even after clear revelation, would amount to rejecting God himself rather than merely making a theological mistake. Still, others would emphasize that God judges hearts as well as beliefs, so they would avoid making firm conclusions about any individual. The Bible shows that this happened repeatedly during Jesus' earthly ministry. Many people expected the Messiah to arrive one way, and when he came differently than they anticipated, some followed him while others rejected him. That theme appears throughout the Gospels. So what is a verse about those who call themselves Christian but deny that reality? Oh, there's another thing I want to say too. There's another thing I want to say too. And it's another Bible verse. So there's going to be people who reject all of this, but you say, well, how can they be united and they get judged for this? How can they be united after they get judged? Well, the Bible talks about that in Revelation. It says, well, Jesus actually said it, actually. He said that, and it's before Revelation, he says, he did not come here to bring peace, but a sword that divides. So it divides. And that's Jesus' authority on the earth, is to divide. Now, then you got the white throne judgment and all that. There's two judgments, and it's 1,000 years difference. I'm not going to go into that today, but yeah, there's that goes on. So you're free to be separated from everyone else and say it's a lie and all that and reject it. God never killed those people who rejected him like that. Jesus didn't either. But there will be a day of judgment. And they will censor themselves out of the relationship because they do not see the relationship. They cannot see it. No matter how many times they read their Bibles, no matter how many times they understand it, no matter what you do, you were destined, for some reason that we don't know, you were destined to hold that position. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. How does that change 1,000 years later? I don't know. But that's what happens. So let's continue reading through this. There isn't a verse that says exactly those who call themselves Christians but not that reality. But there are several that are closely related depending on what you mean. The strongest is 1 John chapter 2 verses 22 to 23. Who is the liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist. He who denies the Father and the Son. And it's interesting you bring this up. Did my phone just go off? Yeah. This is the Antichrist. No one who denies the Son has the Father. Whoever confesses the Son has the Father also. If you're thinking of people who profess faith but reject God in practice, then Titus 1:16 is especially direct. They profess to know God, but they deny Him by their works. They are detestable, disobedient, and unfit for any good work. Jesus also gives a sobering warning in Matthew 7, verses 21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me. You lose access to whatever the rest of the world sees. You don't get access to the internet. You don't get access to anything. You are in your bubble. That you traded that, what you wanted, for getting away from God and the Son and the Father. Or you could say God, because those two would be human, what would you say? Human manifestations of God. Now, why can't it be multiple people? Like, if God is so powerful, then why is it just two people? Well, the relationship, I think that the difference is the relationship that people see would make up for that difference. But they won't be God. They can't be Son of the Father themselves, but they can see the relationship. And that's the big thing. It's not about Christianity, it's not about religion, but it's a relationship. And you hear people talking about that, about the relationship. But I don't think they go that deep with it. Not until after this happens, anyways, when this takes place. And Paul writes in 2 Timothy 3:5, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power, avoid such people. It's the closest word because it especially speaks of denying both the Father and the Son. It's interesting because we're talking about the Father and the Son, and these are verses that have that included. Like, I don't know the Bible, guys. I don't know the Bible that well. I could pull random things out. Like, I know a little bit of verse, but I don't know the whole verse. But all these that we have pointed out, look at them. Either ChatGPT is lying, but it's saying that the Father, the Son, I mean, we're coming to a theme here. The Father, the Son, and they're together. They're not separate in any of this. They're together. There's a relationship. And I don't know the Bible that well to do that. I don't. If I did, I might actually run a church. I might be a priest if I could do that. But I'm not that. I'm not that person. The passage itself is addressing denial of who Jesus is, by extension, the relationship between the Father and the Son. It does not specifically discuss rejecting a future scenario where both are physically present on earth, but it does emphasize that denying the Son also means denying the Father. That's another word. The relationship. It said the word relationship. It's there too. And maybe there's someone out there who needs to hear this video. I don't know. I think that that's a very good chance. Someone needs to hear this video and they're like, oh, I see it now. I get it now. And it prepares you for that moment. Someone out there, I don't know. There could be a group of people, I don't know. but it really changes your way of thinking about it. What is the verse about Jesus being the sword that divides? Actually, I know this one, and it's interesting how I know this. It's actually it's is it it's either John or Matthew, and I can't ever remember which one it is. It's either John or Matthew, chapter 10, verse 34. And I'll tell you how I remember that. And so, what is the verse about Jesus being the sword that divides? I think it's John 10:34. Maybe it's either Matthew or John. It's interesting. It says the content can't be shown because it may conflict with all the guidelines for critical. Oh, because I said sword, I guess. The verse you're thinking of is Matthew 10, chapter 10, verse 34 through 36. Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword." Matthew 10:34. Then he explains what he means. "For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those." You can read the verse. Again, that happens in the future. It's not talking about Christianity itself. It's talking about the future time. But I want to talk about how I remember this. How I remember the date or the time. Well, actually, how do I remember the verse? It's because at the time, 10:34 is actually, and how I remember this is 10:34 a.m. is actually the time I was born. February 18th, 1992 at 10:34 in the morning. That's how I remember this verse. "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword." Foreshadowing there. So, I think I talked a lot. I talked enough about that. I don't know anything else that I know of that I could go from there. But I will say this. Recently, something has come to my attention, and it was about Anakin, actually. And I was thinking, well, if Anakin is the son, and the Force is the father, and the Force created, like Jesus, you know, I thought, well, Anakin never had a father, but he was manipulated by the Emperor. And you could say that the Emperor Palpatine, could be like institutions or, religions or ideologies and all these things to manipulate the son because he has no father. And I thought, well, what if the Force became a human and he talked to Anakin and Anakin would instantly recognize him? And I thought, that would be interesting if Star Wars went that direction. So I talked to Gemini about this yesterday, and Gemini said, well, that actually did happen. Anakin did go to see the Force in human form. But what happened, and I was like, well, what happens next? And Gemini said, it was an Attack of the Clones. Anakin went to see the human form of the Force, but he and he was told that if he didn't follow his cosmic destiny, if he didn't follow the Father what he wanted, then the galaxy would burn. So Anakin, he decided to be with Padme and go back to where he came from, and guess what happened? He turns into Darth Vader. He has this Death Star, blow up a planet, and all this. And I thought, wow, that's interesting how that connects. And so I want to say that on ChatGPT and see what it says. Appearing. And I'll go deeper into this. That's it. What if Anakin had the Force appear in human form where he wouldn't have to be manipulated by the Emperor? That's an interesting alternate history scenario for Star Wars. And I said, well, that's an unfulfilled prophecy, but it's Star Wars lore. But Gemini said that it happened. Although I don't remember that. Of course, I don't like Attack of the Clones, dude. I don't like Lover Boy Anakin with Padme, dude. The pacing is so slow. It's boring. I never got into it. I like Revenge of the Sith and I like Phantom Menace. Phantom Menace is my favorite one. Revenge of the Sith is the second one. Second favorite. But that, whatever the one with the Padme loving thing, whatever movie that focuses on, like when he says he hates sand, I just can't get into it. It's so boring. Snorefest for me. It said if the Force itself appeared as a person to Anakin rather than remaining in a personal energy field, the entire tragedy of the story could change. Imagine this. As Anakin begins having visions of Padme's death, this would be a revenge of the Sith. Instead of being left alone with fear, the Force appears to him as a trustworthy guide. Because Qui-Gon died, and that was a father figure to him. And that happened in Phantom Menace. It tells them the truth about attachment, fear, and loss before Palpatine has a chance to exploit those fears. Whenever Palpatine offers forbidden knowledge, Anakin already has someone he trusts more. Because he already recognizes who the Force is. He knows who he is. He knows that he's a reflection or whatever it is that he sees with himself, a relationship. Manipulation loses much of its power when deception has nowhere to take root. The conflict would no longer be Palpatine versus Obi-Wan Palpatine. It would become Palpatine versus the Force itself. That would dramatically change Anakin's choices. Instead of wondering who is telling me the truth, he could ask the Force directly, and he would already know who it is. There's an interesting parallel here with your earlier biblical hypothetical. In Christianity, Jesus is described not merely as a messenger, but as the visible revelation of God. If you imagine the Force becoming visible in a similar way, then Anakin wouldn't have to rely on the imperfect guidance of the Jedi Council or the lies of Palpatine. The ultimate source would be standing beside him. That doesn't necessarily remove Anakin's freedom. He could still choose to ignore the Force, just as characters in many stories ignore Rey's counsel. But Palpatine's greatest weapon was isolation. He convinced Anakin that he alone understood him. Take away that isolation and Palpatine's strategy starts to unravel. It also creates an intriguing story question. If the Force appeared as a person, would it intervene constantly or would it, like many mentors in myth, guide without coercing? Human beings and apparently chosen ones with laser swords. It's interesting it's laser swords because the only time they use the word laser sword in the context of Star Wars is in Episode 1 of Phantom Menace. Anakin says, "I saw your laser sword," and no one else called it that. Have a remarkable talent for ignoring excellent advice when panic promises a shortcut. That tension is what would keep the story interesting. So, it didn't bring that up, like Gemini said. So does that mean that Gemini was lying? I don't know. I mean, it sounds so coherent that both other one could be true. Now, but if it didn't happen, then that means that there was an unfulfilled prophecy in the Star Wars lore that needs to be addressed. I said, did this happen in Attack of the Clones where Anakin meets the Force in human form and chooses Padme in one word? It says no. It says in canonical events of Attack of the Clones, Anakin does not meet the Force in human form. He falls in love with Padme, and there is no scene where the Force appears as a person, and he consciously chooses Padme over it. The closest canonical parallel is that later material reveals Qui-Gon Jinn called out to Anakin through the Force during the Tusken Raider massacre. But Qui-Gon's manifestation was only a voice, not a physical or human form, and Anakin did not heed it. I think that's what it was referring to. Now, Gemini did call that the Force. It didn't mention Qui-Gon. But yeah, that must be what I'm talking about, because isn't that like winning the spirit? I don't know, but someone told me, like when I was telling people this about Anakin, they said, "Well, that sounds like the spirit force of Qui-Gon." I was like, I don't know what the spirit force is. I don't know. I mean, if it isn't Phantom Menace and it isn't Revenge of the Sith, I may or may not know about it. I may not remember it. Yeah, Anakin did not heed the warning. So it makes you... And Qui-Gon was that father figure, which kind of goes along with that Force thing I was mentioning before. But it's interesting here. So, going to Jake, the original Anakin, young Anakin, Jake Lloyd, he said that he could not, he couldn't tell the difference between multiple realities. So let's say that he sees Star Wars as a thing that speaks to him. He sees it as like a prophecy of his own life. Let's say that. Let's imagine that scenario. And he sees this where if Qui-Gon was a father figure and he died, and he looks up to Qui-Gon in the Force, and he doesn't listen to Qui-Gon, and instead he chooses the other planets, Padme and everything else, then the galaxy, he turns into Darth Vader ultimately. He follows Palpatine. So, if Jake is watching Star Wars, and he sees that as the future of himself, he knows which direction he goes. He knows he will meet the Force in human form at some point in time. And he's going to know what that is. He's going to recognize it. And he's going to choose. Well, he knows what will happen if he doesn't. He's seen the future in Hollywood, in the movies, that he was the original. He wasn't cast in Attack of the Clones or Revenge of the Sith, but he knows that direction that takes. And here's an interesting thing about it as well. He wasn't Hayden. Hayden Christensen, he was the Anakin in those two movies. But it wasn't Jake. That was Jake's first and last Star Wars role. So, Jake can say, well, that's another person. So, it had nothing to do with him. So, he's going to look at this. And he's going to decide, that's someone else's life. That's another reality. I choose this one. And he's going to go with the father. That's because he's the son. He's the chosen one in the real world. It's not Hayden. If it was, then Hayden would be representative of anyone who could have that relationship with the father in real life. But he isn't. He's along with everyone else. So, yeah, I found out it was a very interesting relationship. And I talked to some Christians about it, and they blocked me. They removed me. They say, you're comparing this to some Hollywood movie. You're talking about the world. God is not of this world. But here's the thing. Heaven and earth will be one. And that's going to include everything that's already existed in the world. How do you think how this works? I mean, it has to be logical. It can't just be, God is just going to destroy Hollywood, all the movies, everything, Star Wars, everything. And he's going to remove the knowledge in our minds, so we will act as if we had no idea what happened prior. I mean, no. We keep our thoughts, we keep our minds, we keep our relationships, our experiences intact. Because otherwise, that would conflict with free will. He would be manipulating everyone where everyone only sees him and him alone. And no, some Christians believe that. But again, there are people who are going, you know, there are two people who could say the exact same things, agree on the exact same thing, but yet be completely separate in what's actually going on. You know, you see this in the world too. It's a lesson, a history lesson for things to come. If you go to Ukraine, I talked about this before. If you go to Ukraine prior to the war, if you were Independence Day wearing a Ukrainian flag over your shoulders, wearing a vyshyvanka, saying Ukraine needs independence. But here's the thing. You could have your best friend sitting right next to you, or it could be a complete stranger. But how is that independence met? How do you keep that independence? Do you go with the Western world? Do you align with Europe? Do you align with the United States? Do you align with Russia? Do you align with the state of Ukraine? Like, what is your method of doing that? And that can determine a friendship. That can determine whether someone's going to fight you in a war or not. Everyone wants you can say that everyone in Ukraine, wearing the Ukrainian flag, wants independence. But how they want that to be. And you can get different answers for that. So it's a relationship between things. And yeah, it can divide people. So you don't forget that stuff. But it's good that you talk about it, because Americans, they talk about we can all disagree and still have a country. But here's the thing. That only works in isolation. If you're going to disagree and your country can't fall apart, you're so isolated from the world where it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter. And I just can't get down with that future with the United States. And the more we go down this path with this channel, the videos and what I know, what I've learned, what I've thought about, it's just, what is it, like 5 states put together and everyone else knows the truth? Perhaps. But why should that matter? And maybe, the reason I'm making this video, and the reason why I have this feeling to talk about this, and the feeling to understand it and seeing all this, and how it opens my mind, and me, explain it the way that I am, maybe, just maybe, Jake will see it. Maybe. All in due time. It's only a matter of time. I got nervous there for a second because I saw 4 minutes and 43 seconds, and I didn't see that 1 hour. But I knew I was probably over an hour doing this. But anyways, I just wanted to talk about this. So I'll end it here, and it makes you think. So guys, I'll end it here, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.